Alright guys, so I was thinking about that video that I posted yesterday, and I decided that it was kinda shit. It doesn't really help that much, I don't think. It explained how to do some things, but it kind of assumed that you already knew what you were doing with VBA, and I think a lot of people don't have that kind of experience. So I figured I'd make another video that's a little more just how to do basic stuff in VBA, and then I'm also going to talk about how to get a random sample, because that's a hassle, and I feel like that's hard to figure out. It took me like an hour to figure that out, and I know what I'm doing. So this is going to be just more of a how-to VBA kind of video, so I guess let's just jump right in. Insert a module. So just a couple of general things about the VBA window that you should probably know is this locals window down here. Very useful. If you go to view and hit locals window, it'll pop up. It's not going to do anything for me because I already have it, but I believe by default it's not in there. Get that window, because what it'll do is wow, really? Okay. Sub, make a sub. Let's say I have a couple variables, a equals 1, b equals 2, c equals 3. Then this will allow me to see all of the variables that I have as soon as my code starts executing. And as they get assigned values, if you look down here in the bottom right, we've got this statement, a equals 1. When I execute that, we can see that a is 1, b is 2, c is 3. When you're trying to diagnose your code, when something goes wrong and you're trying to figure out what happened, this is super useful. Also, what I just did, where I went through it step by step, you do that by hitting F8. So I hit F8, it goes to the first statement. Hit F8 again, it goes to the second statement. Every time you hit F8, it runs the thing that's currently highlighted. So at the moment, A is empty, if you look in the bottom right. If I hit F8 again, A is now equal to 1. B equals 2 is highlighted, so when I hit F8 again, it'll set B equal to 2. And you can see that it turns into B2 down here. So that's referred to as stepping through the code. Very handy if you're trying to figure out what's going on. So I guess let's just start really basic, because one of the most annoying things in VBA, if you're not familiar with it, is just setting a variable to be a range. Like let's say I've got, I don't know, cell D3, and let's say I want that cell to be set to some variable. I want to have a variable called dim Mitchell range. I'll define it as a range. And I want that, when I talk about Mitchell range, I want VBA to say, oh, that's cell D3. How do I do that? So there are two ways you can go about it. You can say, so whenever you're defining a range, it's a good idea to use set. So set Mitchell range equals, and then I would say, we're on sheet 1 here. So I can say worksheets. Sheet 1, oh my gosh, sheet 1 dot range, oh my gosh, can I type today? And then in quotes you would say we're doing D3, so it's D3. Easy enough. You can also do something a little bit different. Instead of using range, you can use cells. So you could say cells, and then you give the row, put a comma, and then you put the column. So D3 is 3rd row, 4th column. They do the same thing. It's important to note that they are kind of opposites in terms of how you write them, though. For range, you talk about the column, D, and then the row, 3. So, you know, D3. For cells, you do the opposite. It'll be row 3, column 4. It really just depends on what's what's best for you, what makes you most comfortable, because they do the exact same thing. And as far as I know, there's no computational difference. That I don't think either of them is faster than the other. So whatever you like more, just go with it. Personally, I prefer cells because it defines both, I don't know, axes, if you want to call them that, as numbers, which means they're easy to loop through. And just to talk about looping, if you're going to be using variables to define your range, like let's say I have an integer, mi as integer, and I want to have my range use I as the row, then I would want to say d and I. So it's like this weird string concatenation thing if you're using range. But if you're using cells, it's just I, 4. Real simple. This is why I prefer cells. But again, if you're more comfortable with this like sort of string notation, that's fine. Just, go for it. Things are slightly more complicated if you want to select several cells. Like maybe instead of, I guess, just to keep things consistent, we've got I equals 3. Let's say you wanted to select cells D3 to F5, so you want to select this little 3 by 3 block here. Just for kicks, we'll get an F. F equals 5. So this is get a specific cell. Right? If we wanted to get several cells, then it would look a little different. This is a situation where it's kind of a little bit easier to use range. So you would say, if you wanted to get, again, D3 to F5, then you could either type D3 colon F5, and you don't hold shift down so you don't get a %. Real simple. That's the notation that you're probably familiar with Excel. Or if you wanted to use variables, like we've got our I equals 3, F equals 5 up here, what you could do is you could say D and I, so that's D3, and colon D and F. Oh, you don't want that there. I just find this to be very awkward. It works, but it looks ugly. It's hard to read, if you ask me. Like, what this is saying is D in quotes, so it knows that that's just a letter, and then put whatever I is, which is 3, and then in quotes, so that it knows that's a string again, put a colon and a D, and then put the variable F. So this will turn into D3 colon D5. I hate this. I think it's really annoying to type. But you can also use cells again. This one's a little weird because you actually have to use cells inside of range, but here's what you would do. You would say cells, and we wanted D3, so that was row 3, comma 4, right? And then you would say comma, and you would say cells, and we wanted to go to what, F5? So that would be row 5, comma, and then column 5. So this is kind of awkward, right? But what this is it says I want the range. I want it to start at cells 3, 4, which is, this guy, row 3, column 4. And I want it to end at row 5, column 5. So, like that. I guess I've been being stupid here. That would be column 6. But you get the idea. You would use cells as the basically the start and end point of your selection. Again, I find this to be a lot easier, but it's also a little bit confusing if you're not familiar with the cell notation. This is more annoying to type, but it is also exactly what you're used to if you know even a little bit about Excel. You're used to just saying like, oh, it's from D5 to F7 or whatever. So maybe this is better for you. Who knows? Now, one thing to be careful of when you're setting a range, we're going to get rid of most of this just so that we don't have all this stuff hanging out. So let's say we just have set, Mitchell range as, or equals, sorry, worksheets, sheet 1, and cells 2, 1. So that should give us row 2, column 1. And actually, just so that we can see it, then we'll just say Mitchell range.select. So what that should do is it'll define this range, and then it'll select it in the worksheet. At the moment, we've got this selected, but if we run this, now way 2 is selected. So that works fine, but there's a potential issue you run into here. So I can get rid of this comment too. Let's say you have a different sheet. Now I'm on sheet 2. If I run this code, if I remember correctly, it's going to give me an error. Yeah, it's going to say, oh, select method of range class failed, and then it's just going to highlight this row. That's not a very descriptive error, but you're probably going to run into it a lot if you're selecting ranges. It took me a while to figure out what's happening here. What's going on is these sets, you don't actually get to define a range unless you're on the sheet that the range is on. So, for example, this set Mitchell range thing, it's on worksheets sheet 1. So it's on this sheet over here. The fact that I was on sheet 2 when that statement happened made it so that it didn't actually do anything. So then when I got to here and I asked it to select Mitchell range, it didn't know what I was talking about. So if you see this error, select method of range class failed, what that probably means is you have a set statement that's referencing a range, and at the time that that happened, the sheet that you were looking at was not the active sheet. This is looking at sheet 1. It's like defining a range from sheet 1, but the sheet that I have active was sheet 2. And it's going to fuck up your code. So the way to get around that, if you have that issue, is just make sure that it's the active sheet. So, you know, this is drawn from sheet 1, great. But then right above it, I'm just going to say that dot select. So now, even if I'm on sheet 2, I can run this, and it'll actually go. It'll move to sheet 1, then it'll define this range, then it'll actually be able to select it because it will have actually been defined. So you can see it did actually select cell A2. It's a little thing, but I was banging my head against the wall for like longer than I should have been. So know that when you're selecting a range, just make sure that you're using a set statement and make sure you're on the correct sheet. But really the thing that I wanted to talk about is this getting a random sample business, because it is a hassle. We're gonna make a sub for this. Yep. So sub get a random sample. This took me a while. So let's say we've got 2 sheets. We're going to rename them. I'm going to say data, and then I'm going to say sample. So hopefully this is pretty clear what I'm doing here. I'm gonna put a bunch of stuff in here, and I guess we'll make this easy on ourselves. We'll just say 1, 2, 3, and we will drag that down, and we'll just go down to like 100. Oh, 100. Okay, so we've got 1 to 100. That is our data. And let's just say we want to randomly select, I don't know, 20 values without repetition, right? We don't want any duplicates. So let's try to make a macro that pulls that off. So we'll just try to fill like rows 1 through 20 up with a random collection of all of this stuff. Couple of things that I want to talk about before we actually get started. You'll notice that in class, we don't often use, like, there are functions that you can actually use in Excel, like sum, or like count, or average. Those never seem to come up in VBA. And if for some reason you do want to use one of those functions, you have to jump through a bit of a hoop. Let's say I have, I don't know, I'll just set 2 and 3. Okay, so if I want to get the average of these two cells in VBA, actually, I don't even need to do it this way, that's awkward. A equals 2, B equals 3. If I just say C equals average of A, B, then if we try to step through that, it doesn't know what average is. VBA does not know what the average function is, which can be a little annoying because obviously Excel knows, so you'd think it's in there somewhere, but when you try to use average in VBA, it just doesn't know what to do with it. That's because it's an Excel function, which means before average you have to put worksheet function dot. So if we step through this, A is 2, B equals 3, C is worksheet function dot average A and B, and you can see down here it gets set to 2.5, so that actually works. So we're going to be using an Excel function in our get a random sample sub. Because we're going to be using an Excel function, you're going to see this worksheet function dot thing in front of it. That's why it's there, because if we didn't put it, Excel wouldn't have any idea what was happening. Or I should say VBA wouldn't have any idea what was happening. So, what are we going to use? I don't know if you guys are familiar with the COUNTIF function, but it is the key to this entire thing. Let's say you've got a range 10, 11, 11, 12, and you use the COUNTIF function. You define a range, and then you give it some criteria, let's say 10. It'll return a 1, which means within this range, the range G2 to G5, it saw 10 one time. There's one of them over here. If we edit this so that instead of 10 it's 11, it'll return 2, because there are 2 11s in that range. So great, why does that matter? So let's actually make this thing, and I'll show you why that helps. So this entire thing is going to be done in a for loop. Okay? Now we've got 100 rows here, but we only want 20 in our sample. So I'm going to say, I'm going to dim sample number as an integer. And then I'm going to say for sample number equals 1 to 20. So this is going to be a for loop. And just so I don't forget, I'm going to say next sample number. So our loop is going to go inside here. It's going to start at 1, and then it's going to go down, and it's going to increment, so up to 2, up to 3, up to 4, until it hits 20, at which point it'll go down, loop back up, hit 21, and say, all right, I'm beyond the bounds of this loop because I'm at 21, and it's only supposed to go to 20. Therefore, I should stop, and at that point, it'll advance beyond the for loop. So we want 20 rows of stuff off of this 100 rows, and we want it to only draw in unique values. We don't want to have, like, duplicates, right? So what we're going to do is we're first going to define a random number. I'll call it, so this will be an integer as well, so I'll just say random selection, Why not? So we're going to say random selection equals, and then we're going to use an Excel function. So we got to say worksheets, or worksheet function dot, and we're going to use the rand between function. And rand between does probably what you would expect. It's just going to, it takes two arguments. I'll use 1 and 100. And this is going to give me a random number between those two. So it's going to give me a random number between 1 and 100. So that's cool. And as you might expect, we're going to use that to interact with this because we've got 100 things, and it starts at row 1, ends in row 100. So what we can say is, we'll say set, what do we want to call this guy? We'll call this data to send to sample. That's great. Equals. So I'm going to say worksheets data dot cells random selection 1. All right, so what is happening here, right? So, well, first of all, let me dim it, and then we'll talk about what this is. Dim data to send to sample as integer. All right, so what I want is I want to basically grab one of these numbers, any of them, doesn't matter. I just want to take a random one. So what I've done is I've got this random number, I call it random selection, and now I'm setting this data to send to sample. I guess I'm not getting a range, so I don't need the set statement. So I'm looking in worksheets data, that's this guy, right, the one that actually has the 100, and then I'm saying cells, and then the row is random selection, so whatever this came up with, right, maybe it's 2, maybe it's 50, whatever it is, doesn't matter. It's going to get one of those, and then it's going to look at that row and the first column, so it'll be, you know, somewhere in here. And then it's going to look at the value of that cell. So, why don't we just step through? So, again, look in the bottom right to see variables. So, for sample number equals 1 to 20. So, random selection, and by the way, you can look down here and see that sample number is currently 1 because it's the beginning of the for loop. So, random selection is rand between 1 to 100. So, we go through that, and it looks like it selected 84. So, then it will go to worksheets data dot cells random selection 1. So that means within the worksheet called data, you're looking at row 81, or sorry, row 84, column 1. So that'll be this guy, which is also 84. So, and it's dot value, so it'll give me the value of that cell. So if we press F8, we can see that data to send to sample is now also 84. I think I can drag this out a little. Yeah, okay. So data to send to sample is now also 84. And then it'll go to the next one. We're not doing anything with it yet. I'm just showing that like the loop works. So now it selects a new random number, 79. So data to send to sample is 79. Then it goes to the next one, picks 40. Maybe just to make things a little bit clearer, what I should do is I should... I'm going to change this to like 100, 101, just so that it's not going to be the same as the row. So like, it selected a random number of 94. So that means the data to send to sample will be 193, because in row 94, the value is 193, right? So we're getting a piece of data to send to the sample. That's great. Now what do we do with it? So, oh, also just good practices. If we were going to use this as a set statement, I didn't, but you know, maybe you would say like set data to send to sample equals all of that, and then you would say like, I don't know, data point equals data to send to sample dot value. It would do the exact same thing. You would be getting that number. If you were going to do that, remember that since we're using a set statement and we're defining a range, make sure you do, you know, worksheets dot or worksheets data dot select. That way you don't get that error. Right? Remember that, the like object defined whatever the fuck. So avoid that if you can, but I'm not gonna bother. I'm just gonna keep it how I had. Oh god. There we go. So we're back. Get rid of the set. I probably shouldn't even mention that. That's probably just gonna confuse people. It's fine. So what we want to do is we have a random selection now, right? And we use that to get a random piece of data. We basically picked a random row and then found what piece of data was in that row. So what we want to do is we want to send that to sample if it's not already in sample. So this is where that countif function is going to come into play. Okay, so first I'm going to define a range, because the countif function uses a range, and what I want is I want a range that's going to capture everything that's already been put in to sample. So I can I'll call this dim the sample so far, and that'll be your range. So great, what I want to do, and this time I am actually going to use a set statement, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say worksheets, and this is going to be in the sample sheet, so sample dot select. Now I want to use a set statement. Set the sample so far equals, and then worksheets. I'm just going to type this out and then I'll actually let's talk as we go. Okay, so the range is going to be in the page or sheet or whatever you would call it sample. So worksheets.sample, or worksheet parenthetical sample. Then within that we want a range. Again, I prefer cells notation. So that range is going to start at the cell 1, 1. This is the beginning of it. Every single time it's going to be starting there. So cells 1, 1. And then it's going to end at, so comma, and then new cell statement. It's going to end at some row, oh, oops, and then still column 1. But what is that row? Well, the row is going to be sample number. It's going to start at 1, then once you get a new piece of data, it's going to go to 2, then it's going to be 3, then it's 4. So the row that you're concerned about is going to be sample number. Oh god, sample number. So let's talk a little bit about how this works. Like we said before, if you do range and then define 2 cells, what it's going to say is the starting cell and the end cell. So at the moment, sample number is 1. So what this will do is it'll say cells 1, 1 to cells 1, 1. Or I should say, I'll say through, that way people don't mix up TO with TWO. But so that'll just be this cell. After it loops through, sample number will equal the number 2, which means the sample so far will be 1, 1 through 2, 1. So it'll be this. If sample number equals 3, then it'll be this. And once we're done with this for statement, it'll be pasting data in every time. So to start with, it's empty. But after that first loop, we should have a value here. You know, let's just say it's 100. Then after the second loop, it'll have another value. You know, and so basically every single time, what I call it, the sample so far will be a collection of all the stuff that you've already brought in. So that's fun. Let's just quickly step through and make sure there's no error. There's not. Perfect. Okay, so now we're going to use that COUNTIF function. So we're going to use an if statement. Now remember, COUNTIF, you define a range, and then you pick a specific number, and COUNTIF will tell you how many times that number shows up in that range. So let me type this out. Worksheets. Actually, I don't even need this. If oh yeah, worksheet function. God damn it. Worksheet function dot COUNTIF. My range is going to be the sample so far, and then my value is going to be data to send to sample. And if that equals 0, then I want to do something. So just so I don't forget, let me put my indef, and then let's talk about what exactly this is doing, because it might look a little confusing. So remember, data to send to sample, excuse me, is going to be the actual number that gets sent over. So like it would be, well, for example, if we just go through it right now, data to send to sample ends up being 138 because it's row 39. So if we go over here, row 39 is 138. And again, whenever I'm talking about like the values of variables, I'm looking at this lower window. So data to send to sample is the thing that we actually want to drag over here, but we only want to drag it over if we haven't already captured it in some other row. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, look at the sample so far, which remember is just sort of a running tally of everything we brought in. Now try to find that thing that we're trying to pull in. If you can't find it, which, you know, if it's not already there, then we want to pull it in. But obviously if it equals 1, which means if it's already there, we don't want to pull it in again. So this if statement will make sure that we only get unique values. So I guess we would just say worksheets of what did I call it, sample, sample dot cells sample number 1 dot value equals worksheets, oh geez, worksheets of data dot cells of well, actually, I guess I gotta make things a little bit easier on myself. I could say equals data to send to sample. So let's go ahead and stop this. Let's step through this and see what happens here. And then I'll explain exactly what this is when we get to it. So we start at sample number equals 1. We get a random number between 1 and 100. That's going to be what draws from this data thing. After we get a row, we define the actual value of that cell as data to send to sample. So over here, our random selection was 95, so it'll look at row 95, and it'll look at the value of the first column in that row, so 194, right? So if we hit F8 over here, we should it changes to 194. Perfect. So then we select the sample sheet because we're about to set a range, and if we don't have that sheet selected, it might give us an error. So we go to that, we see that we're now on sample, and then we define this range. Now, if we look down here, we'll actually hopefully be able to see. Okay, yeah, it actually doesn't give a value for the range, unfortunately. So, yeah, but it is there. So now we go, hey, if worksheet function count if the sample so far data to send to sample equals 0, then, okay, so, you know, what is that doing? Well, we talked about it before. It's going to look at the sample so far, which at the moment is just this cell. and it's going to try to find data to send to sample, which is 194 in it. And it's going to go, I am not seeing the number 194 in this range. So it'll return a 0, which means we're going to go into this here. So it'll set worksheets sample, so this sheet, and it'll take the cell of sample number 1. And remember, sample number is what we're looping on, so it's starting out at 1. So this is, at the moment, cells 1, 1, which is the guy we're on right now. It'll set it equal to data to send to sample, which is 194. So if we enter that, 194. Then it'll go back up, and if you look down here, sample number is now 2. It'll do another random selection, 61. Now it'll find new data based on that. It'll look at whatever row 61 is. So it'll do 160. If we look down here, it's 160. So now it'll reset the range. So now instead of just this cell, it's going to be these cells, because it's based on this sample number, and sample number is now 2. And we go through, and now we have 160 in there as well. And we just keep going through, and it'll slowly slap new values in there. Now there is a spoiler alert. This is not going to get the job done the way you want it to. There's one thing that we're missing. So let me go ahead and just run it, and hopefully we can generate that issue so I can show it to you. We'll bump up the rows to make it more likely. Run. Okay, oh, yep, here we go. See? They're empty spaces. What is happening here? There's actually quite a few of them. As it is, this code will sometimes skip rows. Why is that? So, for loops, and I kind of mentioned this, but just to make sure you understand, what happens is it's going to start sample number 1. It's going to go through this and do whatever it can, and then it's going to hit next sample number, and it's going to go up in increments. Now it'll be sample number equals 2. It'll go through, and then it'll come back up as sample number equals 3, blah, blah, blah. Now, what happens if you do end up with a duplicate value? Let's say just by chance, your random selection, and as a result, your data to send to sample, ends up being the same as a random selection and the data to send to sample that you've ended up with before. Let's say, for example, you end up getting a 20 on your random selection, which means your data to send ends up being 119. And then a couple rows later, you generate a 20 again, so you get another 119. Well, what's going to happen is, when you hit this if statement, the COUNTIF is actually going to be 1, because it's going to look at data to send to sample, and it's going to find one in that range. So this bit, the part that's actually supposed to pull data in, it's not going to execute. And then it's going to go to the end, and it's going to increment and go to the next row. So you're going to end up with just a blank cell, because you didn't pull any data in, and then you moved on. And that's not what you want. What you want to do for this kind of thing is you want it to keep trying on a row until it finds something new, and then you want it to move on. So how can we make that happen? I'm going to spoil the mystery for you and just tell you. You can use an else statement. So what this is going to do is, okay, yeah, if you can't find the data to send a sample in the sample so far, then go ahead and paste it in. If you do find it in there, sample number equals sample number minus 1. So why does that? Well, first of all, let me just prove to you that it does work. Boop. And look at that, we have a random sample of 50, no gaps. So we can run this. Boop. Boop. Never any gaps. So why does that work? What is the deal with this else statement here? So like I said, in a for statement, the sample number is going to keep incrementing. Which is bad if you end up in a situation where it doesn't pull in values, right? Which in this case is a situation where you've generated the same random number that you've generated before. Because then it'll skip a cell, as explained before. So what you want to do is make it so that, okay, if you do generate the same number, and so you do end up being able to find that value somewhere in this range, it'll go to this else statement. Say, for the sake of the argument, that this issue crops up on row 7. You've pulled 6 values in, and they've all been unique, but then on the 7th selection, you end up grabbing something that you've already seen before. At the moment, sample number equals 7. It's going to skip this if statement because you found something that you've seen before. It'll go to this else statement, and sample number will turn into sample number minus 1. So in this case, you were at 7, it's going to turn into 6. Then it's going to increment back to 7, and it'll try again. If it gets unlucky and happens to get another value that has already been seen, then it'll go back to 6, and go back to 7, and go back up. And it'll just keep cycling through row 7 until eventually it finds a number that hasn't been used, at which point, instead of being captured by this else statement, it'll get captured by this if statement. It'll paste the value in, and since it does get captured by the if statement, this isn't going to happen, so then it'll increment to 8. I don't know if that makes sense. I would encourage you, if you don't understand it, to put this code in, comment this else statement out, and then, make sure this is cleared out, and then just F8 your way through, and wait for it to find a value that doesn't qualify, and just watch the variables over here change, and watch the sheet, and maybe that'll help you out. Again, I really swear by this locals window. I think it's the best thing. Locals window and F8, super important. But yeah, I don't know. Hopefully that helps. This, I think, is going to be at least a little bit more helpful than the other video I put out. And now you know how to make a random set. Obviously, the thing in the project is a little different because you're like drawing an entire row in, but that's a pretty easy adjustment to make. This is the basic idea that you can use. Hopefully this is helpful. And as before, if you have any questions, hit me up.